Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wireside Chat. I'm Paul Whitcover, the Associate Dean of the Online MFA, and I'm joined today by one of the Online MFA instructors, Jan Watson. Hi, Jan.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
Very
And hello
good.
to everyone joining us today. Thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us as well. I'm going to just introduce you to everyone. Jan Watson, who publishes under her full name, Jan Elizabeth Watson, is originally from Maine and moved to Pittsburgh in 2019. A graduate of Columbia's MFA program, she is the author of the contemporary fiction novels Asta in the Wings from Tin House Books and What Has Become of You from Penguin Random House. She is currently writing a work of creative nonfiction, tentatively titled Close Lid Before Striking. When not teaching or writing, Jan moonlights as an occasional jazz singer and book reviewer. She particularly appreciates stories with a distinct and narrative voice and a demonstrated love of language. Very interesting. So let me ask you right off the bat about your decision to publish as Jan Elizabeth Watson rather than
Mhm.
Jan. Was there another Jan Watson out there? What made you decide to do that?
Believe it or not, there is another Jan Watson out there who is an author, much to my chagrin.
Uh-huh.
And Jan Watson, the other author, is a lady who very genre focused. She writes Christian Western romance
Oh
novels.
my gosh.
Can you imagine? That's so
That's
specialized.
like it really is.
Yeah. So, but to distinguish myself from that Jan Watson, who does have a following, I
Hmm.
include my middle name, Elizabeth. So, and in some ways, I've debated at times a pen name. And I don't know if
Yeah.
those of you listening, any of you ever think about using a pen name or currently are using pen names, but it's a little bit of a conundrum because in some ways we do want to be acknowledged and recognized as ourselves, right? But then sometimes if we have a name that's too familiar or just
Yes.
doesn't quite have that flow that we want, it's something that we consider. Oh, you
I've
do,
yeah,
Elizabeth.
I've yeah, Elizabeth has one for her fiction.
Hmm.
And I've considered using one in the past, mainly because my books under my own name have not sold very well, right? So I feel like sometimes I need to rebrand myself. Although I haven't
Right.
done that yet, I'm still publishing under my name. But there's especially in the genre world, there's a lot of authors that have gone on to success under a pseudonym.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you wanted to hop genres, you or anybody else, for example, if you were known as a speculative fiction author and you wanted to write a romance and you were concerned that people wouldn't buy a Paul Whitcover romance, you could use a different name.
That's right. I could trick them.
Yep.
So what about your two books? Were they both thrillers? How would you characterize them?
I wouldn't say that they're both thrillers. The second one was definitely marketed as a thriller. I think both of them had elements of literary fiction, and both of them did skew a little dark. My fiction tends to do that, or at least has. I leave myself open to more versatile, lighter fiction maybe in the future, but they're both somewhat dark thematically. But I wouldn't say that the first one was a thriller because it's in part about a young girl who is in a terrible home situation and is very bonded to her young brother. And they escape the home and embark on basically an adventure towards a new life. So there's not really a thriller element to that. The
Right.
second novel does have a more distinct thriller element because there are murders in it and a certain, not so much of a who done it, but a why done it, I guess you would say. So a bit more of a psychological thriller, but also literary elements in it.
Yep.
It's probably not a very by the book thriller in the sense of following all the protocol that one usually expects to see in a thriller, but definitely elements of the thriller in it.
I mean, when I see in a someone's bio that they come out of the Columbia MFA program, I do expect to see literary elements in their
Yeah,
fiction. What was it
right.
like to be in that program, writing from a kind of with the dark thematic elements that you mentioned earlier, with maybe aspects of other genres that might perhaps be frowned upon? I don't know. And
Hmm.
in Columbia, was Columbia open to other genres than purely literary fiction?
N- Not precisely. And you know that in terms of genre determinations, it's so funny because as we all know, there is some quote unquote literary fiction out there, which technically it's kind of genre fiction, right? There are
Hmm.
certain works that by and large are sci-fi novels or they're romances or they're thrillers, but for whatever reason, they get embraced by the literary fiction community and sort of get put under that umbrella as well. So
Right.
it's a little bit
I'm looking at you,
arbitrary.
Station 11, right? That's a good
Yes,
example.
that's a great example of a book that really crossed over. So, and occupied both of those spaces very comfortably. So, um, yeah, I was writing darker stuff than a lot of people were, and I was just sort of, oh yeah, she's the one that's writing the dark stuff, but it still had literary elements to it, so I got by. It was a generally diverse group of students. We were writing different kinds of things, but none of it was genre fiction per se. I have to say, like a lot of MFA programs in the country, there was an element of almost elitism in regard to how they looked at genre fiction. You know, they would say, "Ew, you know, I wouldn't write sci-fi or I wouldn't write a
Mhm.
romance, things of that nature. But they would write a novel that had elements of sci-fi or elements of romance. So it really is more about, in some cases, the labeling. And one of the things that I do think is very unique about the MFA program at SNHU, which I didn't have the opportunity to do, is to explore genre and also to explore different practical aspects of publishing. When I was at Columbia, and it was a wonderful program, I studied under some wonderful people. I studied with Jonathan Franzen and Michael Cunningham, and
Wow.
yeah, you know, big names, but
Heavy hitters.
um, yeah, the heavy hitters, exactly. To name just a few, but there was really no practical application of how do you become a published writer, and once you finish this thesis, what do you do with it? You know, it was just sort of this art that we were creating in a little vacuum. So
Yeah.
I loved the experience, but it's a very different kind of experience from what students in our MFA program have. So I'm kind of glad to be able to teach in a program like this where students really do get a sense of what their careers can look like.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that because that was a big part of what we were trying to do when we designed this program. Because when I was in my MA, which was at City College of New York,
Mhm.
it was this. I was the only person in that program that was writing speculative fiction with
Mhm.
literary elements,
Yes.
or so I like to think. But I mean, the point is that just as you experienced in Columbia, I really did not learn anything about the practical aspects of being a writer, and I
Mhm.
kind of had to figure it out on my own and make
Yes.
a lot of mistakes. And so it was important to us to try to steer students clear of all of those mistakes and give them like a better chance. So to that extent, I'm glad that we have succeeded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so and your first novel, though, when you were describing that, it made me think. I mean, I'm kind of sticking with genre here.
Mhm.
We, how old was your protagonist in that novel?
Well, it was a kind of a retrospective narration. So
Ah, okay.
presumably the narrator is an adult. The age of that narrator is never specified, but clearly it's filtered through kind of an adult looking back at a time when she was 7. So it's a
Okay.
child seen through a somewhat adult lens.
So but it was like a first person narration.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting approach. I'm actually kind of working on something like that right now.
Mhm.
It
Yeah, interesting.
gives you a lot of freedom, right? Because you have that perspective shift that isn't available to the younger version of the child,
Hmm.
who's actually experiencing all this stuff. But it's challenging too because you can't give away too much. In the voice of the older narrator,
Right.
how did you find that balance?
Well, one thing that I did, which is something that I'm very how should I say this? I feel very close to my childhood still. I was a very observant child, a very sensitive child, and I have really good long-term memory. So because of that, it's very easy for me to recall what the experience of childlike was like for me. And sometimes when I remember certain things from childhood, you almost get into that sort of childlike mindset again, that you recall those feelings that you had as a child. And my narrator was sort of like that as well. So even though she was an adult, sometimes it almost seemed like she was reliving the childhood experience with some of these memories. So it wasn't like there was a real psychic distance between the adult narrator and the little girl that she once was. It was sort of like they were one being. That was sort of the way I approached that.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Well,
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick that up. I apologize that I haven't read it, but
Oh, that's all right.
it just sounds fantastic. So
Yeah.
I would love to read it. And I want to just remind everyone that's in our audience, please post questions in the chat for Jan, and I will certainly ask them, and she will certainly answer them to the best of her ability. So one other thing that struck me in your bio was you mentioned that you're a jazz singer. And oh, what is the name of that book? That book, I'll put it into the chat. I just have to copy and paste it. Here we go. Here we go. Asta in the Wings. Kind of a theatrical aspect to that title. Does that play a part in the novel?
It does to an extent because the little girl is obsessed with movies. So there's a lot of old movie references woven
Yep.
throughout the book.
Yep.
Yep.
And what, like an old movie reference? Well, what constitutes old in the context of the book?
Silent movies and
Oh,
things from
wow.
the 40s or old movies. Yep.
Right.
So
Well, that must have just been a terrible part of researching the novel, having to watch all those movies.
I'm kind of like a Turner Classic Movies junkie. So for me, not at all, but yeah.
Right. No, I was kidding, obviously, but yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds great actually for to have to watch some of those movies, or not even have to, but just kind of go back. There's so much to be discovered in them.
Absolutely. Oh,
So
good
here,
question. I'm sorry. There's a really good question from Dow, was it?
yes, that's Dow. And that was the question that I was kind of working my way around to. So thank you,
Oh.
Dow. So how did jazz rhythms come into play in your writing and your pacing? And the other thing I wanted to ask in relation to jazz is just the idea of improvisation and whether that plays any part in your composition process.
Improvisation. Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things I do love about jazz singing in particular is it is so improvisational. And I think I have an improvisational approach to writing as well, right? There is a certain spontaneity. And I know in our classes we do a lot of work with outlining and preparing and synopses and so forth, which is fantastic. But I tend to use a more intuitive approach with my own writing, at least in the early first few drafts, and discover as I go. And I think that there's sort of a correlation between the approach to jazz, where, when you sing, if you're singing a particular song, you might not always sing it the same way twice, because in the moment you might decide to bring something different to it. And then the more you sing it, much like with your writing, you begin to identify, okay, I'm going to do this little improvisational bit that I've done before, but I'm going to insert it now. So it's sort of like mindful improvisation, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not completely off the cuff, and I think fiction works that way a lot too. It has the air of being improvisational at times and looking effortless, but really a lot of forethought went into it.
Yeah. I mean, I've read jazz musicians talking about their approach to jazz and how much more of it really has to do with just what you said, study, practice, forethought, right? And
Mhm.
knowing what to do in the moment because of past experiences as a player. And I
Mhm.
feel like that's certainly one of the important stages of becoming like a successful writer. It's successful just in the sense of like having control over your medium is when
Right.
you reach that point of feeling confident enough in yourself to kind of like be improvisational and bring those skills and tools into play, um, to answer the demands of the moment in your story.
That's right. That's right.
So
And
when you, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
oh, well, just to Dow's question about rhythm, because I think that's such an interesting point. I love that you mentioned that because I think that rhythm is so important in writing. And that's an element that we don't talk about a lot. And yet, I think it's something that should not be overlooked. And this is why, and maybe some of you do this too, I always read my work out loud to myself. Not only because that helps you to detect any errors or weaknesses, but it really helps you to hear the rhythm of the writing. And I think that good writing has a kind of musicality to it. It's pleasing to the ear, even when you hear it. When you have those sentence structures that sort of ebb and flow, and maybe shorter sentences and longer sentences, and just the combination of words you choose. I think we read it a certain way on the page, but it does sort of create a sense of music when it's done really well. So that is something I do think about a lot in my writing. Yeah.
I'm really glad that we're addressing this because I feel as though rhythm and pacing is not talked about like in our program or really anywhere to any
Mhm.
great degree. And I think the reason may be that it's just hard to come down with any hard and fast rules about it. So much of it is kind of subjective. So
Yeah.
how do you learn how to recognize and implement these elements into your writing?
That's a very good question. And off the top of my head, I don't know that I have a great answer for that question. I know that I absorb rhythm through reading, and I am a very avid reader. I always firmly believe that reading is always going to be your number one teacher as a writer. So, first things first, read everything you can get your hands on, read in your genre, read outside your genre sometimes too. It's all grist for the mill. You absorb a lot about language and usage and rhythm and story structure. And I think that much like when you listen to a song over and over, you pick up the rhythm of it, and pretty soon you can sing it too, and you can tap your toes to it or whatever. And I think reading is a lot like that as well. You just begin to absorb those rhythms in a way where you can kind of emulate them and bring your own spin to them.
Yeah, I feel like emulation is so important. Um, I know a lot of times writers are very afraid of, I don't want to sound like so and so. I don't want to
Mm.
be, I don't want to copy them. But I really do feel like emulating the not the necessarily the subject matter, but just like the kind of ineffable qualities of a piece of prose, which are rhythm and pacing. Um, that can teach you so much, even if you're not picking it up like consciously and going, oh, well, here's what I learned from this sentence of, Don DeLillo's or something. But instead it sinks in on a deeper level, right? And then you sort of start um, becoming aware of it in your prose, and then you can play around with it and make it more your own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, did you go through a process of like kind of like emulating or other writers?
Probably when I was really young. I started writing very, very young. By the time I was 6, I knew I wanted to write books. But just it was just something that I started doing really, really early. And so, of course, when I was a teenager and I had these aspirations of being a writer, I probably did blatantly imitate people at times. And through imitation, though, you can find your own voice. I think that's a very natural way to begin, is through imitation, and then sort of chipping away at that imitative surface, and then finding where your voice is in that and developing that. When I was an undergraduate, actually, I took some creative writing classes, and one exercise that we had was we had to pick a specific author and write something in their style. And I thought
Yeah.
that was a really interesting exercise.
Yeah. You know, I used to teach at the Gotham Writing Workshop
Uh-huh.
in New York. And one time I think I had a couple students. Can't remember. They were coming into Gotham, uh, but they had also worked in another kind of writing studio. Maybe that was called the Writer's Studio, but it was a program that taught writing exactly in the manner that you just described.
Mm-hmm.
Students were drilled in learning how to precisely imitate the styles of a variety of writers. And I always thought that was so interesting, such an interesting approach. Um, I don't know that I would have wanted to go through it exactly
Yeah,
myself for an entire program, but just as an exercise, it seemed like it could be useful.
absolutely. I mean, I think for anyone listening to this, give that to yourself as a fun assignment sometimes. Just pick a favorite author and see if you can write a couple paragraphs as close to them as you can, just to sort of see how is this different from what I do and how is it
Yeah,
similar.
yeah. And to go against your own natural rhythms, I think can be very useful because it's easy to kind of fall into habits as a writer and to fall into
Mhm.
a certain rhythm without necessarily being aware yet that there are other rhythms that are available to you and other styles and other approaches.
Right.
So yeah, I think that can be a really good exercise. Here's another question from Dow. Was there a genre you wrote in more when you were younger, and did
Mhm.
something happen to shift your direction?
Um, Boy, thinking about my early stuff, I've always been kind of pretty consistent, I think. I've always sort of liked the somewhat dark stuff. I did was very interested in mysteries per se. I read a lot of Agatha Christie when I was
Yeah.
young, and I definitely thought, "Ooh, I want to write mysteries." And I tried to write a couple when I was really young. I think I wrote most of a mystery novel when I was about 19 years old, and I'm pretty sure it was terrible. The novel did not survive. I didn't do anything with it. And the manuscript, I don't think has survived. Um, but it was really hard, I realized,
Yeah.
to do a good
Yeah.
mystery.
Yeah,
But that was
they make it seem so easy.
it looks so easy. Yeah, absolutely. I still like to read mystery from time to time, but I've never tried to write a true blue mystery. Maybe that
Hmm.
would be a good challenge for the future.
Yeah, after you finish your current work in progress.
Yeah. And I wrote poetry too, by the way. I did write a lot of poetry when I was younger and kind of moved away from it. It's been a very long time since I wrote poems, but
Yep, same.
supposedly I was somewhat good at it. So
Same here, except for the somewhat good part. But I feel like, that's because we were talking about like, well, where does an awareness of like rhythm in prose come from? Well, that's one
Mhm.
place it can come from, right? Is poetry.
That's
Um,
true.
I feel like, reading poems is a real resource for fiction writers and nonfiction writers. But anybody that's writing prose can really learn a lot from poetry and pull a lot from poetry.
I completely agree. And I like to read poetry sometimes for just language inspiration. So,
Exactly,
yeah.
right. Because the juxtapositions are they're coming from a different place than they are in fiction.
Hmm.
So you're encountering language being used in a different way than what a fiction writer would normally the way a fiction writer would normally use it.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so we're getting a lot of so let's go back. So like when you say like all of your you've always been drawn to the darker themes. Like, who were some of the writers that you read when you were much younger, when you were just deciding like I'm going to be a writer and this is the kind of writer I want to be?
Um, I really liked Ruth Rendell. I don't know if you know her, but she was a
Sure.
British writer who did, I don't want to say mysteries, but like psychological suspense. Died a few years ago. I liked a lot of her stuff. Um, Definitely an influence. I'm trying to think who else. I read a lot of, literature. I was very into like the Victorian novelists, the Brits, when I
Yeah.
was younger. And I still think you could read somebody like Dickens and learn so much about characterization.
Oh yeah. No,
He was such a master, you know?
yeah, I'm a big Dickens fan. Were you reading like Wilkie Collins and people like that?
Yes, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. The Moonstone and The Woman
yeah,
in White. I really like
right,
both of those books.
right.
Yep,
And they're kind of proto mysteries, right? Or thrillers
absolutely.
in their way.
Yep.
Very interesting. All right, I'm going to continue pulling some stuff out of the chat here for you. Do you follow an outline? Well, you kind of talked about this,
Mhm.
that you're a very intuitive writer.
I tend to
Has
be.
has outlining become in any way part of your process as you've become, more experienced as a writer, or do you still just wing it?
More than it used to be, thank
Yeah.
goodness, because I have to say winging it is not always the most efficient way. It does tend to make the process longer.
Yeah.
And I'm a slow writer as it is, which is just unfortunately how I am. I'm very busy career-wise, so I just unfortunately don't have the time to churn it out as much as I should. But oh, by the way, my cat
There we
agrees with
go.
that. There's my cat, Betty.
Oh, very, very pretty. Yeah,
But
excellent.
but now I do some outlining. I usually think of it because I work with chapters generally. So in my current project, I do have an outline with sort of a thing of what's in each chapter. You know, not
Yep.
every little thing or every little beat, but the general sense of what each chapter covers. And I'm just sort of plowing through chapter by chapter in that way. So it does help to have some kind of structure in place
Yep.
for
So
sure.
you're kind of shifting genres a little bit from fiction into creative nonfiction. So can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that shift and the differences
Yeah,
that you're
well, it's
discovering?
interesting. I know it's a little scary to write non-creative nonfiction, which is somewhat autobiographical because you really are putting yourself out there. That's where I start to think about pen names and
Yeah,
you know,
right.
but if you're going to do it, you might as well commit. And I have certain stories that I've wanted to share for a while, so they're very much in my head, and I feel like they're fully formed, and it's just a question of transferring them to the page and being vulnerable and getting the time to get it all rendered in the best possible way that I can get it. But it's still storytelling. You know, storytelling is storytelling, and whether it's made up out of whole cloth or whether it's partial reality or full reality with certain embellishments, we're still thinking about the principles of storytelling and reaching an audience and having tension in there somewhere and having an arc that has some kind of a climactic moment. And so a lot of the same principles still come into play.
Where's the dividing line though, like between the reality as best you remember it and then the creativity that you're bringing in as a fiction writer?
Well, I think the answer, different authors would answer that differently. There is a lot of fictive license that some people take with autobiography or memoir, which to some people, it's funny, you hear certain readers criticizing that and saying, you know, they're recalling conversations word for word that they no way could have remembered. But you know, we do bring certain fictive constructs to nonfiction because obviously we don't remember whole conversations verbatim. We have to recreate
Right.
them, right? And so we have to think about what did this conversation sound somewhat like, and what in particular do I want this conversation to deliver to the narrative in a way that represents a certain degree of accuracy, but it's also interesting to read because we have to
Right.
remember the interesting to read part, right?
Right.
The essence, exactly. So certain liberties are taken, but I think it's up to the individual author as to absolutely how faithful to truth do we want to be. Some years, this was a long time ago now, but some of you may have heard of a writer named James Fry who wrote a book called A Million Little Pieces, which was supposedly a memoir about all these horrible ordeals he'd been through. And then it was exposed that he made up the entire story and had experienced none of this, and the public was indignant about this. It pretty much wrecked his career. So,
Right.
so I think we have an ethical obligation to be as truthful as we can, but with the understanding that we still are using storytelling devices and sometimes can bring in some creative flourishes to tell the higher truth of the story, if you will.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel as though, I've read a lot of memoirs, historical memoirs and things like that. And I mean, yes, they have to hew to a certain, factual content and the order in which maybe events happened and everything. But I mean, you really can't read them without realizing that they've been shaped according to, like you were just saying, like a storytelling, template.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I think it would be impossible to find an autobiography or a memoir that was not creative, that didn't have that creative element. Now we're just being more upfront about saying this is creative nonfiction.
Right, right. Yeah, creative, the term creative nonfiction, which was, I don't even know when that term emerged, but it's not the oldest term, but I think it gave more liberties for
Yeah,
writers in a way. Um, so so we could reconstruct a little bit,
right.
reconstruct and deconstruct. So
It feels like something that came out of the 60s. I don't know if that's
it
true or not.
could be
Yeah,
60s, so 60s, 70s, I think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Like with the new journalism, it seems like it kind of related to that somehow.
Yeah, it's very true that even when we tell someone about our day, I mean, we might not tell it precisely the way it happened.
We
It's
definitely don't. I mean, how many times do you like recount something that happened to you? And as you recount it to a succession of, listeners, you find that that anecdote changes its shape. It becomes more pointed. You become more economical, perhaps, in telling it, or maybe you
Mhm.
spin it out a little bit more. I don't think there's
Yeah,
anything wrong with that.
right, right. As long as the story still resembles what happened in some manner, then I think it's all okay.
Right. Or maybe even as long as the audience is enjoying it. I mean, maybe that's where
Yeah.
the line is drawn. I don't know. I don't know. I
Hmm.
mean, but
Hmm.
people are very suspicious of writers in that way, right? Is this all a lie? Are you just making
Hmm.
it up, or is there a truth buried in here somewhere?
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. But it's interesting that some people are exclusively nonfiction writers and some people are fiction writers. And I've always thought I lean toward both. I read a lot of nonfiction in addition to fiction. And I love the absolute freedom of being able to create without having to worry about any obligation to truth. So I think that would always be my favorite. But I also like facts and I like working
Mhm.
with facts and presenting
I
them
mean,
creatively. So,
but I mean, even if you're writing fiction, there's still a certain fidelity to fact that you
oh,
have to,
sure.
right? You
Yeah.
have to do your research and make sure your settings are accurate, or if there are intersections with the actual historical timeline, things have to they either have to align, or there has to be some purpose to the non-alignment.
That's right. That's right.
I
Even
mean,
if you're world building a world that doesn't exist, it has to be believable, right? It has to
yes.
have that ring of authenticity. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty lazy person, so I feel as though I was drawn to fantasy and speculative fiction under the idea that I could just make it all up. I wouldn't have to do any
it
research, but that turned out to be very wrong.
didn't make things easier, did it? Yeah.
No, it did not. I don't think it made things harder necessarily, but it certainly didn't eliminate the need for research.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Can I
here's
ask
an
you a question,
Oh,
Paul?
yes, of course. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Here's a question. They might get a kick out of this question. So, what do you think about writing about something that you've never experienced? Let's say you wanted to write a novel set in India, but you've never been to India. Do you think you can do it with research only?
Yeah, I do think I could do it. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think other writers could do it. Like my novel, I wrote a novel about Dracula.
Uh-huh.
Universal. There's the Dracula was written by Bram Stoker, which is in the public domain, and then there's Universal Pictures Dracula with Bela Lugosi. And believe it or not, that is still owned by Universal Pictures. It's a
Hmm.
distinct entity. So they approached me to write a sequel to that movie. So I did, and that movie, a lot of that, it was set in World War One, in the closing days of World War One, and a lot of the action takes place on battlefields in World
Hmm.
War One. So I had to do a lot of research into like World War One and what it was like to be on the battlefield, in the trenches. And that's something obviously I've never had the opportunity to do, thank God.
Yeah.
Um, but I
Yeah.
was able to read like a lot of first person, primary source material. And from that, I could piece together uh, um, enough that I was able to achieve what seemed to me to be a sense of authenticity. And it satisfied me. So I feel like I could do that,
Hmm.
with other settings, other times. I mean, the other question though is should you do that, right?
Mm,
Because like if
right.
in your example writing about India, well, what right would I have as a white male living in America to like potentially burgle someone else's
Mm,
culture? And that's
yeah,
a very fraught question these days for
it
sure.
is. It is. It's a
What
tough
what is
question.
what is your answer to that?
Well, I agree with you. I certainly think it can be done. There are sort of the cultural sensitivity issues that you mentioned that one has to be careful of, and that's a tough one. I don't know 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if we'll still be talking about this exactly the same way, but currently we have to be careful about appropriation and writing from the perspective of a culture that we have no personal experience with and not representing it correctly. So there is that, but just in general, even if it were, say, writing about London, right? And I've never been to London, I've been to Ireland, but um, I've certainly read a lot of books set in London and seen a
Oh
lot of
yeah,
movies set in London. But
right.
could I write about it just based on that kind of knowledge and additional research? Probably, yes. Would there be a Londoner that would read the book and read something and say that detail isn't right? Probably.
Yeah.
So it's hard, but definitely not impossible. And but most people do write that way. Certainly in the early days of writing, before we had access to the internet and before people were able to travel widely, it was all imagined, right?
Or
So,
taken from books,
or
right?
taken from books,
Because
right?
like you could, if you read a few novels of Dickens, I think you can begin to take a stab at a description of a London street that
Yes,
might be very
absolutely.
redolent of Dickens, but still would be recognizable as London or London adjacent or something like that.
Sure, sure. I think I could do it. Yeah, absolutely. But it's a little scary. It's a little
Yeah,
scary to go into such a project because you got to do some heavy research and you
right.
have to be able to give it all the ring of truth. So, yeah.
Exactly.
But that shouldn't hold anybody back if you're interested in writing such a thing.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I was going to ask you a question, which is, have you ever had an idea that you kind of are extremely interested by, but at the same time recoil from a little bit because of the demands that it would put upon you? And you sort of think to yourself, well, this is it's going to be a real challenge and one I'm not sure I'm going to successfully meet. And
Right.
yet you also feel like it's it's in your way. It's like an obstacle to your further writing career. You've got to get this book or story or whatever out. It's got to be done so you can move past it, move forward.
Hmm.
Have you
Hmm.
ever experienced something like that?
Absolutely. I have ideas. That is a really good question. And I do have such ideas often. I get these really ambitious ideas. And sadly, I'm just in the interest of truth here, a lot of times I just have to say, I don't think I can take that on. But sometimes I have gone with ambitious ideas and worked through them. But it's interesting as writers, we all have our individual strengths. You probably, whatever your individual, what do you see as your biggest strength as a writer, Paul?
Oh gosh. Um, just like I'm too stupid to give up. That's probably my greatest strength.
That's a great answer, actually, because that's a really important trait to have. Um, I guess for me, in terms of execution, I would say um, I think I'm very good at showing people's interior lives. And I'm kind of an introvert, so that's probably why. We all have certain things as writers that we just happen to do really well. To use the musician analogy again, some people might be really good at hitting a really high note, whereas other people maybe can't hit that particular note, but they might do something else really well. So I think a lot of us try to play to our own strengths. A lot of us recognize sometimes when we're hitting a limitation. And I like the idea of always trying to push ourselves and grow past our limitations, but there are some things that I just know I wouldn't be able to do well, right?
Yeah, no, I feel the
So
same way. I
yeah,
would really wouldn't even attempt them because
yeah,
they're kind of foreign to who I am as a writer, I guess. I would have to be a different writer in order to find those challenges worth
yeah,
undertaking, I guess.
right, right. Or
But
sometimes you just have
which
to
isn't to
say,
say that I can't really appreciate them in other writers and writers that really do that thing. Well, like, comedy is I mean, I love writers like Terry Pratchett, for example, is
hmm
just like a fantastic fantasy writer, just really, really funny. Or Jack Vance is another one who's really funny. Very mannered writer. I mean, I would never write like him in a million
yeah.
years, but I appreciate his sensibility so much that I can, devour his works and never grow tired of them.
That's actually a great example, at least for me, because I have thought about writing a comic novel because, believe it or not, I'm very funny
I
in
believe it.
life.
You've been pretty funny in this interview.
Oh, thank you. No, well, no, I don't know if I have, but I can be quite funny. But for some reason, I can't write funny. And I've not been able to figure out why. I should be able to. I mean, I can write, funny one-liner social media posts and that sort of
Right.
thing, but I can't sit down and write a funny piece of fiction. It's sort of like when I try, it's not funny, but if I'm just doing something off the cuff, it's quite funny. And that frustrates me because I love comic and satirical novels, and I would love to be able to do one. I haven't completely ruled out the possibility in the future, but for some reason, something is getting in my way, and I
Yeah.
haven't been able to figure out exactly what that thing is. It's like I get too self-conscious or something. If I think too hard about being funny, I kill it. I don't know, but I'd love to be able to figure out the answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you will ultimately. One thing that writers have is time. And
Mm.
it seems that we don't, and so many of our students are in a hurry, right? Because they're young and they want to succeed immediately, or they're older and they're tired of waiting. Um,
Mhm.
but I mean, I've really found like I have to approach my own writing um, as though I had an infinite amount of time in which to do it, because otherwise I screw myself up. I obviously know I don't have an infinite amount of time. I'm lying to myself, but I have to approach it that way. Like when I'm, working on a novel, sitting in front of the computer, I have to just let it's going to take as long as it takes. And I mean, you're a slow writer, so you must understand that too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yep, exactly.
All right, let's dig into the questions here again.
Yeah, we've had some
Um,
questions.
yeah, somebody says maybe it's the darker themes. Maybe you need
Yeah, it could be.
some lighter themes.
Or the MFA itself. I think there is that part of it's funny, as much as I appreciate absurdity and I'm not afraid to look foolish in life, there's something about my writing where I still, we want to be taken seriously in a
Mhm.
way, right? And I
Right?
think that allowing ourselves to be comedic, and being a buffoon on the page, as it were, even if it's done smartly, it's a different kind of vulnerability. And maybe
Well,
those of us who want to write funny just need to let go of that.
yeah. I mean, 'cause criticism always stings, right? As a
Yeah.
writer, no matter how often how much you get used to it over the course of your career. But there's different types of criticism, and I feel
Mhm.
as though the criticism that basically is saying that's not funny. That's a
Yeah,
really wounding kind of criticism because that gets to something very personal, doesn't
it
it?
does.
You don't want
It
to
does.
hear that. I mean, when you make a
Mhm.
joke, you want somebody to laugh. You don't want them to go, that's not funny. Um,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
maybe I mean, the more I think about it, I feel as though you're really exposing yourself when you write, you know, when you try to write a satire or a comic novel like that, you're letting it all hang out and
Yeah.
in a way that really leaves you vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And humor is different for everybody, right? So it's
Right.
what strikes me as funny might not necessarily strike the next person as funny, and we have
Absolutely.
to take that into account.
Yeah. Must be really hard to workshop a comic novel.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I would be. Interesting though.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever been in a workshop where somebody is writing a comic novel. It's always, you know, it's always something more readily identifiable as, you know, a particular genre in the speculative realm, usually for me.
Mm-hmm,
They
mm-hmm.
might have funny moments, might have very witty dialogue, but they're not
Sure. Yeah.
specifically comic novels.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see here. Okay, here's another question from Dow. We're really, Dow, you're earning your money tonight. So what are the things you're juggling with, and not to be personal about it, obviously, but what are the things you're juggling with in your busy career? Could you describe like a week in your life? And maybe what I would say is like a week in your writing life. What would that look like?
A week in my writing life. I'm weirdly, as I get older, I'm more of a morning writer and a really, really early morning writer. Like before we've really moved into dawn, sometimes I'll be up and have
So
some
like, what does that mean?
coffee.
Like you get up at 5 o'clock or four
Yeah,
o'clock?
like five
Okay.
sometimes
Hmm.
even four. For whatever reason, that just seems to be a productive time for me. So that's when on this current project, that's when I've been doing a lot of the writing is early. And that's the time also where I can put more work stuff aside,
Yep.
um, and just work uninterrupted. So that's mostly what I manage to do in terms of what I schedule in the writing with all the grading and teaching and so forth that I do. So
Yep. And do you teach in other institutions beyond Southern New Hampshire?
yeah, I actually teach full time for the University of Pittsburgh.
Oh,
So
okay. And
yeah,
are you teaching creative writing there as well?
I teach. Yes, I teach creative writing. Sometimes I teach creative writing, but mostly I teach the foundational writing classes. So persuasive
Okay.
writing.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's a very, very demanding
yeah,
type of
yeah.
teaching.
I have a lot of
Um,
students. So yeah,
and then you have your SNHU responsibilities on top of that, which
right.
I mean are can be also pretty extensive. I mean, you've taught in the thesis classes before,
Oh yeah,
and those can be quite demanding as well. So
absolutely.
I mean,
I
if
just
if
finished
you
the thesis MFA 702, and you're writing these rather long thesis letters for, 12 to 15 novels, right,
yeah,
in 10 weeks. So, but I love doing it. I consider these are my fun classes. So,
oh good.
yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. But I mean, I also write in the mornings, and it's like that's the only time that really feels mine.
Mhm.
I owe my time to others in the rest of the day, whether that's in my personal life or my work life.
Mhm.
I can't claim the same degree of solitude.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can you write? Do you write? Do you need to write like in solitude? Do you need quiet? Do you need to be alone? Can you write out in a coffee shop, for example?
I'm pretty flexible actually. And it's interesting. My partner is also a novelist and he he has his own little writing office, but he's very specific about his environment and how he writes. And I'm pretty flexible about it. I mean, once the iron is hot, it's hot. And
Hmm.
once I'm in that headspace, I can pretty much do it anywhere. And I'm very good. I grew up as the youngest in a large family, so I'm great at tuning people out when I need
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
Um, just a
an
skill that I
important
have.
skill.
Yeah, yeah. I also listen very well when I need to, but if I need to tune things out, I'm very capable of doing that. So that kind of thing that could be very distracting for some people, it doesn't really bother me. Yeah.
So I'm gonna shift our topics here because Jackson in the chat has reminded me that one of the things we were going to talk about tonight was publishing and submission of work and what it is that publishers are looking for and what is the proper way to approach them and all that kind of stuff. So let's address that. We've got 10 minutes left. Let's turn our attention to that, because I know you had some things you wanted to talk about in that vein.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I used to work as an editor when I was coming right out of grad school in New York City. I first started working in editing before I got into teaching, and so I have a lot of experience with that and with agents. I know a lot of students have questions about getting agents. Should you get an agent, and how do you go about approaching them? Or and if you don't use an agent, how do you go about approaching the publisher? So I don't know, do any of you have any specific questions or concerns in regard to that, the publishing end of things?
Yeah, please put them in the chat if you do. Where did you work as an editor? Were you working on fiction? Oh,
Yes,
here we go.
I worked at Harcourt.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, self-publishing is such a viable thing nowadays. It really has changed from what it used to be. You know, self-publishing used to be, you know, you had somebody had a Xerox machine and you made a bunch of copies and gave them to your friends. But now we hear all these stories about self-publishing novels that do really well. So that's a whole other area that I don't have personal experience with. Sometimes I have students ask me about self-publishing and I can't personally advise on that because I've worked through the traditional publishing route, but I do have some experience about what happens when a novel is submitted and how to get your novel looked at and so on and so forth.
Well, Brandon is asking how to approach an agent. What is the, and let me just throw in my plug here that every student in the MFA that completes 702 is invited to pitch their work to a literary agent, and
That's right.
and that happens twice a year. So that's one way you can approach an agent, but that's not the only way.
Absolutely. Well, there are a lot of, different writing events around the country, some of which may be coming to areas near some of you, where also you could share your work with agents, or you could do pitches or things of that nature. But if you're just looking to submit to an agent, one thing that I always did, and this is so simple really, but because I do read a lot and I go to the library a lot, I love to buy books, but realistically, we can only have so many books in our home. So I do read a lot of library books too. And whenever I always look at the acknowledgements page and see who did the author thank. And usually they thank their agent. So when I was looking for an agent back in the day, I started compiling lists that way.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, it's just like who are we thanking here? And particularly the authors whose books I liked. And that gave me a really good sense. So that's something that I encourage people to do, is just start to take note in that regard of some of your favorite newer books and see who represented them, who got thanked. And that also gives you a good point of connection, because when you write to that agent, you could say something, I'm a great fan of your client so-and-so, and I think you might also like my work because I write about, these kinds of themes. So generally, they want you to send a query letter, much like the query letters that students work on in our program. And then my novel is about such and such, this character is facing this situation. You share a couple of comparable titles and you send it off. It does help to look at the agency websites, because many websites will have multiple agents working in the same house, and all of them have very thorough web profiles now on their pages, where they will tell you what is each one looking for.
So and what they're not looking for.
Yeah, not looking for. Pick the one that seems like it would be a good fit, and then tailor that particular message to that individual. Some of them will also say on the website that you can enclose some pages, right? So with your query, some may say you can enclose 10 to 25 pages, or even up to the first 3 chapters, which is great, because that means you're saving some time. If they like what they see in your email, they might also read your sample pages. And if they like your sample pages, they will request more, which is exactly what everybody hopes would happen.
Yeah. I mean, one caveat that I would add there is if you're an unpublished writer, starting out looking to publish your first novel, traditionally, don't start querying agents until you have a completed novel ready
That's
to
right.
go.
That's a good
Because
point.
because if you turn in 3 chapters in there and that's all you got, and they come back and say, well, I love it, show me the rest, then you look bad. You don't look professional because you have to say, well, I haven't written it yet. I'll get
Mhm.
back to you next year when
Right.
I've got the draft under my belt. That's when you should be
Exactly.
querying in the first place.
Hmm.
Here's a question. What would red flags be as you're looking for agents? What would be some red flags that you would want to take note of?
Red flags about the agents themselves.
Yeah, I think so. Like, what would be danger signs as you're looking?
Well, I would never go with anyone that asks for money ever. I
Yes,
mean,
thank you.
flat
Yep,
out.
yep.
Anyone asking for money, that their credibility is questionable. They should be finding money for you, not asking for money
Thank you
for
very
you.
much. Music to my ears. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there are a lot of people out there that take money to get writing published project, but you shouldn't have to do it that way. You should get paid for what you do, I believe. So
Yep, I
that is
also
probably,
believe that.
yeah, that is probably the biggest red flag. But it's pretty, most of the agencies, it's pretty easy to verify that they're legitimate. And a lot of agents seem to move around quite a bit. So, for example, you might see one agent who's currently working for one publishing house, or rather, one agency, also previously worked for a couple of agencies, or they start their own independent agency. So
Yeah,
if they have that kind of background, they've been in the business for a while, they have a lot of contacts. Um, and
yeah,
there's always a question of, do you want to go with an older established agent, or do you want to go with the young and hungry one, right?
right.
There's something to be said for the newer, younger agent because they're very eager to prove themselves and they might fight harder for your manuscript. So
Yeah,
there's really no wrong way to go with that. It's just a little bit different whether you go with the older established or the new agent who is eager to set a reputation for themselves. But
yeah,
where I think an agent with some experience is very useful is that they know the market so well and they know it's really, especially the New York publishing industry, it's also inside baseball.
yeah,
They
it
all
really
know
is.
each other.
Yep, they
And
go
when they
out for
see your
lunch.
manuscript,
Yep,
yeah, they
yep,
do. It's a community. And when they see your manuscript and they like it, they think, oh, Elizabeth over at such and such would really like this. Or Kevin over at such and such would be interested in seeing this one. We as writers don't know that stuff. We don't know Elizabeth and Kevin, right?
right.
So we're just sort of blindly throwing stuff out there and hoping somebody likes it, but they have the inside track and can really accelerate the process for us. So that's
Yeah.
why I tell students agents can be really helpful.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. I mean, I feel, there's ways if you're interested in traditional publishing to get your book in front of an editor.
Hmm.
And, the editor, you can go to a conference, there's many ways to do it, to have an editor express interest in your work without an agent. But if that ever happens, I feel like you should get an agent immediately.
That's true.
If a publisher expresses interest in your work, um, then it's time to then armed with that, you should be able to get a good agent,
Hmm.
because they don't have to do any work, right? They already know the publisher's interested, and then they can just do the work that you want them to do, which is get you the best deal that they
That's
can get
right.
you.
That's right. Yeah.
Um,
The best deal they get for you is the best deal they get for themselves. So they have a
right,
stake in it. Yeah.
right. And the other thing, we're kind of running out of time here. This has been a fantastic evening. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're
Um,
welcome.
But like one of the things that from MFA 505 on, we talk about the literary community and how, writers are not in competition with each other. We're all supporting each other. And yet you would think, well, that's true of writers, but it's not true of agents, right? Because agents are in competition against each other, sort of.
That's
But
right.
but what you described happens all the time. An agent will say, well, I can't this isn't right for me. It's not right for my portfolio. I don't have the time for it right now. It's a great idea. So I'm going to pass it on either to somebody else in my agency or to some other agent that's in another agency. Because these are all people. The thing about agents is they're by and large people who really love books. They
That's
love to
right.
read. They love writers. And they really want to see writers succeed.
That's right. They do. They love what they're doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in fact, you often see, you mentioned like there's a lot of fluidity between like, agent moving between different agencies, but you also see editors, from publishing houses become agents and
Yes,
agents
true. Yeah,
become
that's
editors. So
true.
it
Right.
goes back and forth all the time.
Yep. No
And
question.
I guess that brings us to the end of our night. Well, Jan, maybe we can have you back at some point and we can
Yeah.
continue the conversation. This has really
Part
been
two.
wonderful. Exactly,
Yeah.
part two.
All
The
right.
dark side. We'll get into the dark
Or
themes
the
of
light side,
publishing.
maybe.
Yeah, it'll be a laugh riot next time.
We will. We will. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming.
Yep, thank you so much.